This semester we've been looking at lessons from the desert. Debbie and I this summer got to travel through the Holy Lands and see the real desert and how that's often different than maybe what we think of from West Texas or Arizona or whatever. It's more of a wilderness that's extremely hot, but yet there's a little bit of vegetation. But in that, we've been talking about these desert lessons, and so today we're going to be talking about the idea of that the wilderness sometimes becomes a refuge for us. I want you to think for a few minutes about maybe the most creative meal you ever had. One time we didn't have hardly any food, and I went to the pantry and really couldn't find anything. There were some noodles. We had a little bit of garlic, a little bit of olive oil, and a little bit of butter. And so I boiled the noodles, and I put some olive oil and some butter and some garlic in it, and then I found just a little bit of Parmesan cheese, put it in there and made it, and now it's become one of our family's favorites. But it was out of necessity that we created this idea, particularly the boys like it with chicken or whatever. But think about how to be creative when no matter what you have, here's this little bit, how that becomes so important to you. In the midst of our world, often we're looking to say, what do I have? What can I work with? How do I come out of this? And what you find is, the idea is that God always provides enough in your life to help you through it. So raising four boys, I think that the greatest thing I had to do was keep them alive. They're so adventuresome, and we used to take turns going from one ER to another, and it seems like every time we brought them in for stitches or whatever, they would take me in another room and question me like, all right, what'd you do to them? And I'm like, no, they're boys. But just keeping them alive was incredible. And in the midst of our world, just making it through is sometimes all that God asks is just trust me to make it through. And I'll never forget holding one of my sons down so that they could stitch up his eye, and how that was so hard. And as he looked to me for help, and all I could do was hold him there, because if he moved, it could be perilous for his eye, and trying to hold him there. And he trusted me, knowing that somehow, even though he was hurting, he would get through this. You see, when bad things happen, I think the world watches for our response of what's going to happen. So in the midst of this desert season, maybe that we're in right now, where we're quarantined or we're away from everybody else, we wonder, where's God in the midst of this? And the world is watching. You that have hope, you that have faith, how are you going to respond? And how you respond will make a difference of whether they believe, maybe, if there's a God or if he's in control or not. The thing I found in the midst of the desert, or the things that we're trying to learn, is some are pretty short seasons in the desert. Some are long and painful. There's no question that in the midst of our desert, it leaves us uncomfortable, at least for a while. And usually in that uncomfortable situation is when we change. So what God calls us to in the midst of this desert is that he's our refuge. It's kind of like maybe Notre Dame and the Hunchback is when he goes in and he calls for sanctuary in the midst of the church. So we go to God and we call for sanctuary, for peace in the midst, that God becomes our refuge. Our text today is from 1 Kings chapter 17. There's this battle going on between God's prophet Elijah and the evil king Ahab. And Ahab thinks that he can do whatever he wants and that he can kill God's prophet and all God's people. Elijah's trusting God. He wonders why God isn't acting more, and why he is really on the run in a lot of things. So in 1 Kings chapter 17, God says to Elijah, you're going to go tell the king, by the way, that there's going to be a drought until I say there's not going to be. And he's kind of afraid of that. But he goes and he tells the king, and then he runs away. But God provides for Elijah in this ravine. And while he's in the ravine, the animals, the birds, take care of him, and there's a brook. And for this period of time, God provides for him. But eventually that dries up, and I'm sure the prophet goes, okay, what now? There's still no rain. How am I going to be it? How am I going to make it through? And we sometimes have gone to the end of our ropes and say, how are we going to get through this? But what Elijah didn't know is God had already provided a widow in another place to take care of him. And so he goes, and there with the widow, there's enough every day just to live. Just enough every day until the drought ends. That's often, I think, when we trust God the most. So in the midst of your desert season, as you run to God for refuge, I think God will give you just enough every day. I don't know why some desert seasons last so long while some are short. I think sometimes it's because we're supposed to learn a valuable lesson and we don't always learn that lesson. But we're going to provide a couple questions that you can either, if there's somebody in your house that you can ask and talk about these things, or you can pick up the phone or Zoom some of the people that you know and look at these questions and answer them and talk to people. In the midst of your desert, I don't know how long it's going to be. In fact, in the midst of the coronavirus right now, we wonder, when will this be over? But I think that God continues to work and says, all right, when bad things happen, the world's watching for your response. So find refuge in God. Maybe pick up the phone and talk to somebody and realize that somehow God's got this and He's got just enough today for you to make it.